You're listening to the Rot-Weiss-Rot Report, the podcast for those living and working in Austria. Each week, we bring you the key news and events in a clear, concise format, so you're always up to speed on the changes that matter to your work, your paperwork, and your everyday life. This week on the show, the Austrian government has passed a new budget that could leave every household up to 300 euros worse off per year. The Austrian army receives its largest ever budget, while the Chief of General Staff announces his retirement. Familienbeihilfe for refugees is being scrapped. Who loses out and why? 1 in 3 GP surgeries is no longer accepting new patients. What can you do to avoid being left without care? Austria spent 15 hours choosing a new director for public broadcaster ORF, amid accusations, profanity, and, eventually, a winner. A record-breaking heatwave is bearing down on Austria. Where will it be hottest, and where can you find relief? All that and more, coming right up. But first, the main stories of the past week.
On the 9th of June, the Austrian government officially presented its double budget, the Doppel budget, covering 2027 and 2028. Finance Minister Markus Marterbauer of the SPO described it as forced but necessary. In previous episodes, we noted that this is arguably the most radical and controversial budget proposal in years, but it reflects the reality of Austria's situation. The country is currently running a budget deficit of over 4% of its Bruttoinlandsprodukt, that is, its GDP. This exceeds the limits set by European Union rules. In its most recent forecast, the European Commission even launched what's known as an excessive deficit procedure against Austria, the fiscal equivalent of a yellow card in football, a warning. The country must either cut spending or raise taxes. After lengthy debate, the government chose the former. But who will be footing the bill? The Momentum Institute, a research organization traditionally close to the trade unions and the Arbeiterkammer, where Marterbauer himself worked before joining the ministry, carried out what it called a Verteilungscheck. That's an analysis of exactly who bears the brunt of these savings. The conclusion is stark. The budget is cutting the wrong things. The headline figure is 277 euros. That is how much the average Austrian household stands to lose per year once all the new measures are added together. It amounts to 0.5% of a family's average annual net income. That may not sound like much, but there's an important caveat. Those hit hardest will be people in what's known as the lower middle class. They earn just above the poverty threshold, which means they don't qualify for support aimed at the poorest. At the same time, the government is cutting the universal benefits this group has relied on. They're caught in a trap, not enough income of their own, and less state support to fall back on. As a share of income, this group will lose more than anyone else in Austria. So the government is planning to save nearly 2 billion euros. First, it will significantly restrict the right to paid educational leave and career change support, the so-called Bildungskarenz and the Weiterbildungsgeld allowance. Second, healthcare funding and health insurance contributions are being cut. This means patients will more frequently have to pay out of pocket for certain medical procedures, certificates, and medicines. On the positive side, the government has decided not to raise VAT, the Mehrwertsteuer, or income taxes on official wages. So shop prices won't shoot up as a result of the new budget, and your net salary will remain unchanged. What's more, the new rules won't kick in until 2027, leaving some time to prepare. But if you're on a lower income and in employment, you are likely to feel these cuts in your wallet.
And yet, amid all these cuts, there is one area of the new austerity budget where the money is flowing in rather than out. On the 11th of June, Defense Minister Claudia Tanner unveiled the military's financial plan, and the figures are striking. Next year, the armed forces will receive over 5 billion euros. The year after, nearly $5.5 billion. For context, in the early 2020s, the Bundesheer's budget was under $2 billion. In other words, it has more than doubled. It may look like a paradox. The government slashes spending across the board while the military gets more and more. But there's a clear logic to it. Since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, all of Europe has fundamentally reassessed its approach to security. Austria is a neutral country, but neutrality does not mean defenselessness. The Bundesheer is undergoing active modernization. New helicopters, new armored vehicles, expanded cyber defense and communications systems. All of this costs money. So the new budget is not only an attempt to navigate a fiscal crisis, it is also a clear signal that the country is prepared to invest in a modern army and the protection of its borders, because that is what today's European reality demands. There is, however, another interesting detail to this story. Rudolf Striedinger, the current Generalstabschef and the country's top military commander, is due to retire on age grounds in September. So the Bundesministerium für Landesverteidigung, the Ministry of Defense, has already announced an open competition for his position. If you happen to be job hunting in Austria, you might want to take a look. The salary is certainly respectable, at least €13,187 gross per month. That's a bit of a joke, of course. Yes, the vacancy is entirely real, and technically anyone can submit a CV. But there is one very significant catch. The candidate requirements include several decades of exemplary service in senior roles within the Bundesheer. So a standard management degree, unfortunately, won't get you very far. On a more serious note, in today's Europe, the position of military chief is far more than a prestigious title. Whoever becomes the new Generalstabschef, and wherever they direct those new billion-euro budgets, will have a direct bearing on the security of everyone living in this country. Meanwhile, last week the Austrian government announced an important development. Enhanced border controls with 4 EU member states are being extended. The borders in question are those with Slovenia, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Under the Schengen Agreement, there should be no permanent checks or passport controls between these countries. But Austria has once again invoked a special exemption in European law and extended the restrictions. The officially stated reason, cited by Interior Minister Gerhard Kahner, is the complex migration situation across Europe and heightened security concerns. For those of us living here, however, there is one very important practical detail. The format of these checks is now changing significantly. The Austrian police are moving away from fixed checkpoints and control posts directly at the border lines. Instead, mobile units of police and military personnel will operate within border zones. In plain terms, you could be stopped for a document check not at the barrier itself, but already inside the country, several kilometers after crossing the border.
In addition, a major European reform known as GEAS, the Gemeinsames Europäisches Asylsystem, or Common European Asylum System, officially entered into force in recent days. This is an enormous legislative package that EU member states have been negotiating and debating for years. The reform will affect absolutely everyone currently going through any form of protection or status application in any EU country. Among the key changes, asylum procedures at the EU's external borders will become significantly faster. A clear and strict list of so-called safe third countries will be established, and new rules for distributing refugees between European states will come into effect. We'll go through all the details that apply to those directly affected a little later, in our dedicated Migrants News segment. On other major stories this week, Austria has finally chosen a new Director General for the country's main public broadcaster, ORF. The supervisory board tasked with making the decision sat for a record 15 hours. The new Generaldirektor is Clemens Pigg, the former head of the Austrian press agency, APA. Why does this matter to all of us? ORF is far more than just state television and radio. It is a media giant funded directly from our pockets through the mandatory ORF Beitrag levy, which almost every household in Austria is required to pay. The decisions made by the new director will determine how that levy is reformed and what programs and services we receive in return. The selection process itself turned into something of a drama. The board spent hours hearing from 9 finalists. Then, according to Austrian media reports, what followed behind closed doors was a fierce series of rows and backroom scandals, including profanity and threats of legal action. The centerpiece controversy of the evening: one candidate was accused of having generated his entire television development strategy using artificial intelligence and presenting it as his own work. Despite all the chaos, Clemens Pigg won convincingly in the very first round, securing an outright majority.
And finally, a story for anyone who uses social media. The Austrian government is preparing significant changes to the laws on online harassment and defamation. Under a law currently in force in Austria, if someone posts an abusive or offensive comment beneath your Facebook or Instagram post, it is you, as the account holder, who may be held legally responsible. Justice Minister Anna Sporer has proposed putting an end to this. She has developed a straightforward mechanism. If someone has insulted you in the comments, you must first send a written request to the account owner to have the content removed. The account holder will then have 3 working days to respond. If the comment is deleted, the matter is resolved and no legal action follows. If it is ignored, then the account holder bears responsibility. The logic is simple. You are only liable if you clearly knew about the offensive content and did nothing about it. The opposition party, NEOS, has fully endorsed the proposal. Their legal affairs spokesperson, Sophie Vögele, argued that punishing someone for another person's words they may not even have been aware of, simply defies common sense. The OVP, however, is pushing for even stricter rules. State Secretary for Digitalization, Alexander Pohl, believes the reform will not work as long as people can hide behind made-up usernames. The party is again advancing its long-standing idea of a Klarnamenpflicht, a mandatory requirement to register on social media only under one's real name and surname. The coalition is still debating the finer points, and the draft legislation is still being refined. But the overall direction is already clear. The authorities finally want to punish the authors of abusive comments, rather than the people beneath whose posts those comments appear. In the meantime, while politicians argue, we simply encourage everyone to be civil, both online and in real life. And now, on to business and economic news.
The government has approved an increase in fines for road traffic violations. The measure is expected to bring in an additional 80 million euros per year. The new rules will come into effect in 2027. What exactly will change? Speeding fines will rise by an average of 20 to 30%. The penalty for jumping a red light will increase significantly more. Improper parking, ignoring prohibition signs, those will go up too. The precise scale of fines has not yet been published. The final version will be adopted in the autumn. But the increases will be substantial. It is worth bearing in mind that Austria already has some of the highest traffic fines in Central Europe. For example, the current penalty for using a mobile phone without a hands-free device while driving already stands at 140 euros, and it will go higher. So if you are in the habit of taking calls at the wheel, now is very much the time to break it. Meanwhile, the Austrian parliament has passed a new Stromgesetz, a sweeping electricity law. Put simply, The government has decided to push for a dramatic acceleration in the construction of solar panels and wind turbines. Austria currently faces a genuine bureaucratic nightmare in this area. Obtaining all the permits and approvals required to build a single wind turbine can take anywhere from 3 to 7 years, one of the longest timelines in the entire European Union. The new rules are intended to cut that timeframe at least in half, as the government aims to cover Austria's entire electricity needs from domestic renewable sources by 2030. Why does this matter to us? First, it will directly affect our electricity and heating bills. The more solar and wind capacity Austria generates at home, the less dependent the country will be on imported gas, the price of which has been wreaking havoc with household budgets in recent years. Second, this means a significant number of new jobs. Installing, connecting, and maintaining these facilities will require a large workforce, and that means quality employment in a growing sector. And third, the law will make it easier for people to join together and share electricity with neighbors, bypassing the large energy corporations.
Renewable energy is all well and good, but there is a far bigger line item in most of our monthly budgets: rent. Last week, fresh data from a property market analysis confirmed in hard figures what many of us have been feeling in our wallets for some time. Over the past 10 years, rental costs in Austria have risen by an average of 40%. Official wages over the same period have increased by just 20%. In other words, housing is getting more expensive twice as slowly as incomes are growing. What does that mean in practice? We are each handing over a considerably larger share of our salary for a roof over our heads than people were 10 years ago. This hits migrants who have arrived in Austria recently particularly hard, as they are forced to navigate the property market at today's elevated prices. However, there is one important legal safeguard that could help you hold on to your money. If you're renting a flat, it is worth checking whether your building falls under the Richtwert system, a specific law that caps maximum rental prices. The state strictly regulates rents in older properties built before 1953, as well as in many buildings constructed before 1993. But landlords frequently, whether deliberately or not, breach these rules and charge above the legal limit in their contracts. So before you sign any lease, contact the Arbeiterkammer. They will review your rental agreement free of charge, and if the law has been violated, they will push the landlord to reduce the rent and return any overpayments you have made in previous months. And to end on a lighter note, good news for anyone who enjoys a proper breakfast. The European Union has officially adopted a new directive with a rather charming name, the EU Frühstücksrichtlinie, the Breakfast Directive. It has finally drawn a line under a rather amusing dispute that had been rumbling on in Austria for decades. Until now, under strict EU legislation, the word Marmelade could only appear on a label if the preserve was made from citrus fruits, oranges, lemons, or grapefruit. Strawberry, cherry, or apricot varieties were required to be labeled Konfiture. This rule had been lobbied through in 1979 by the United Kingdom in order to protect its traditional orange marmalade. When Austria joined the EU in 1995, it was forced to comply, much to the frustration of local producers. That absurd restriction has now been lifted. The word Marmelade can once again be used officially for any fruit preserve. So Austrian grandmothers who spent their whole lives making strawberry jam and felt they were barely on the right side of EU law can breathe easy. The directive also brings far more significant changes that will improve the quality of food products. First, the EU has substantially raised the standards for the fruit content of jam. From now on, the minimum fruit content per jar must rise from 350 to 450 grams per kilogram of product, and for the premium extra category, at least 500 grams. In short, jams will contain considerably more real fruit and far less sugar. Second, the new rules will deal a serious blow to adulterated honey. Labels with vague phrases such as blend of EU and non-EU honeys, typically used to conceal cheap Chinese sugar syrup, will be banned. Producers will now be required to clearly list all countries of origin on the label, along with their precise percentage shares. Austrian breakfasts, in other words, are about to get considerably better. And on that note, we move on to our most important segment.
On the 10th of June, a decision came into effect that has received very little public attention, but it is already in force, and it affects tens of thousands of people. The government has ruled that individuals with so-called subsidiären Schutz, subsidiary protection status, who are in the Grundversorgung system of basic state support, will no longer be entitled to Familienbeihilfe. Let us unpack those terms. Familienbeihilfe is the monthly state allowance paid for children. The amount depends on the child's age, ranging from around 130 to nearly 200 euros per child per month. For larger families, this adds up to a substantial sum, potentially several hundred euros every month. Who are subsidiär Schutzberechtigte? These are people who have been refused refugee status under the Geneva Convention in Austria, but who cannot be deported because of the dangers they would face at home, due to war, civil conflict, or the risk of torture. This category includes, for instance, some citizens of Syria and Afghanistan, as well as Ukrainian nationals holding temporary protection status. And Grundversorgung is the state system of basic provision for those who are entirely unable to support themselves. It covers modest accommodation in shared housing, food or a food allowance, and basic health care. People in this system who are not working have no independent income of their own. They receive just 62 euros and 50 cents per month for personal expenses. So now, if you hold subsidiären Schutz, are registered in the Grundversorgung system, and are not in employment, Familienbeihilfe payments for your children will no longer be made. However, if you are officially employed and have your own income, this restriction does not apply to you. Family and Integration Minister Claudia Bauer of the ÖVP explained the decision in these terms. Grundversorgung already covers basic needs. Additional family benefits should not become a pull factor for coming to Austria. In plain language, if you want child benefit, go and get a job. Caritas, however, strongly disagrees. The organization's representative Daniel Zipfel warned that the move poses a real risk of child poverty. There are people in the Grundversorgung system who simply cannot work due to age, illness, or disability, and their children bear no responsibility for that.
This controversy did not arise in a vacuum. The authorities already have relevant experience to draw on. In Vienna, for example, people with subsidiary protection were previously moved from the higher Mindestsicherung social assistance to the minimum level Grundversorgung. The Public Employment Service, AMS, has now published its first assessment of that move. The result made headlines. The number of registered unemployed in this group in the capital dropped instantly by 36%. Most of them did find work and became self-sufficient, something the city authorities regard as a major integration success. Caritas, however, says people were simply pushed into a corner with no way out, and were forced to take whatever work was available, however grueling, unpleasant, or poorly paid, where they were openly exploited. As a result, some dropped out of language courses and vocational training, which strips them of any realistic chance of finding decent work in the future. If this situation directly affects you, make sure you clarify your current status. If you have any form of work or income, ensure that all your paperwork is completely in order. If you are genuinely unable to work due to health reasons, document this as thoroughly as possible with your doctors. For free legal advice on your specific circumstances, you can contact Caritas, Diakoni, or Volkshilfe. And another story on the theme of tightening restrictions, this time from Interior Minister Gerhard Karner. He has officially announced plans to significantly raise the bar for Familiennachzug, the family reunification process. The key change? The authorities want to substantially increase the minimum level of official income that a migrant must demonstrate before being permitted to bring their family to Austria. This is not yet a passed law. It remains an official ministerial proposal. But the overall direction is unmistakably clear. The rules are getting tougher. A practical note. If you are planning to reunite with family members in the near future, do not put it off. Begin your paperwork now, under the current and somewhat more lenient conditions.
Meanwhile, on the 13th of June, the sweeping European asylum reform known as GEAS officially entered into force. The same new EU rules that prompted the Austrian government to move so hastily to strip child benefit from unemployed individuals on basic support, as we discussed earlier. Why is Europe doing this now? The core aim of the reform is to halt the chaos at the borders and ensure that people from countries with low asylum approval rates do not make it deep into the European Union. They will now be screened in closed facilities directly at EU external borders and deported within a matter of weeks. A strict, safe third country rule is also being introduced. If a migrant reached Europe via Turkey or another country deemed safe, they will be sent back there rather than being allowed to remain in Austria or Germany. For those already living in Austria, this means a wholesale overhaul of the entire bureaucratic process. The Migration Authority, BFA, will now operate under considerably stricter and faster procedures. The key practical advice is this. If you receive any official letter from the BFA in the coming weeks, read it with extreme care. As a result of the reform, new requirements may appear in correspondence, or deadlines for responding may be significantly shorter than before. If you open such a letter and do not understand what it is asking, do not ignore it and do not leave it sitting on the table. Seek free assistance immediately from Caritas or Diakoni, because a missed deadline right now could cost you your status in the country. Alongside this, internal administrative procedures have also changed at a purely Austrian institution. The Pension Fund, PVA, has updated its processes. This concerns not only pension calculations, but also applications for disability recognition and the Parkausweis, the special parking permit for people with disabilities. If you currently have an open case with the PVA and are waiting for a decision, do not be alarmed if a letter arrives with updated forms or new requests for information. This does not mean something has gone wrong with your case, or that you are being refused. It simply means that officials have switched to new document templates. The important thing is to fill everything in and send it back promptly, because an avoidable delay on your part could push your case back by months.
And finally, a story on healthcare, which is always a particularly pressing issue when you're living abroad. The platform Krankenversichern.at conducted a major survey of over 1,100 doctors working within the public insurance system, the so-called Kassenärzte. The results are frankly alarming. Approximately 1 in 3 such doctors in Austria has declared an Aufnahmestopp, meaning they have completely closed their books to new patients. And in some medical specialties, the situation is nothing short of catastrophic. In dermatology, Nearly 66% of practices are not accepting new patients at all. In gynecology, the figure is 65.5%. In other words, if you are a woman simply looking for a gynecologist on standard public insurance, 2 out of every 3 surgeries will turn you away at the reception desk. In ear, nose, and throat medicine, known here as Hals-Nasen-Ohrenheilkunde, 36% of doctors are closed to new patients. In psychiatry, the figure is 33%, and in orthopedics, 32%. Why has this happened? Doctors are consciously limiting their patient numbers because they physically cannot provide adequate care to those they already have. Demand for healthcare is also rising sharply as Austria's population ages and the number of chronic conditions grows. And a growing number of doctors are leaving the public system altogether, moving into private Wahlarzt practice, where patients pay for appointments themselves without going through insurance, and the earnings are considerably higher. What can you do? Above all, do not wait until you are genuinely unwell before you start looking. Find your Kassenarzt in advance.
Vienna News. This week in Vienna, it is going to be very hot, in the most literal sense. According to the ECMWF, one of the world's most accurate meteorological centers, temperatures could climb to 39 degrees Celsius. The city's official record stands at 39.5. In other words, we are very close. The city is already preparing. The Magistrat Wien is activating its network of Kühlstellen, cooling centers. These are public buildings where cool temperatures are maintained. Libraries, certain municipal buildings, and large shopping centers. Their addresses are published on the city's official website. Search for the word Kühlstellen. A few practical reminders that are easy to overlook. Drink water constantly, without waiting until you feel thirsty. In the heat, fluid loss happens quietly and without warning. Drinking fountains, Trinkbrunnen, are available almost everywhere in Vienna, and the water is clean and cold. Avoid going outside between noon and 4 in the afternoon, when the sun is at its most intense. Never leave children or animals in a closed vehicle, even for 5 minutes. The temperature inside can reach 50 to 60 degrees within minutes. This is a potentially fatal risk, and in Austria there is a real financial penalty for it. If you have elderly people in your life who live alone, give them a call. Heat is especially dangerous for those over 70 and for people with chronic heart or respiratory conditions. We hope this won't be needed, but here are the warning signs of heat stroke: severe headache, dizziness, nausea, hot and dry skin, confusion. If you notice these symptoms in someone, call 144 immediately. Take care of yourselves and try to wait out these hottest days somewhere cool. And now, the rest of Vienna's important news. This week, Austrian media were buzzing with a story that could easily have caused alarm at first glance. Researchers at the Medizinische Universität Wien have identified a new tick-borne virus in Austria, the Alangshan virus, or ALSV. The story immediately spread across headlines warning of a new threat. But there is absolutely no reason to panic. Scientists were quick to establish one crucial detail: this virus did not suddenly appear in Austria. It has been quietly and entirely unnoticed circulating among local tick populations since at least 2020. It simply wasn't detected before because doctors lack the tests to identify it. What is more, during field research in wooded areas around Vienna, this new virus was actually found in ticks more frequently than the already familiar tick-borne encephalitis virus. The most active zones are, naturally, the large green expanses on the outskirts of the city, the Wienerwald, the hills of Kahlenberg and Leopoldsberg, and Donau-Auen Park. Most people who contract the virus experience no symptoms at all, or only mild ones. The problem, however, is that there is currently no treatment or vaccine against the virus anywhere in the world. The only reliable protection is proper prevention. So when heading out to large parks or woodlands, wear enclosed shoes, tuck your trousers into your socks, and check your entire body carefully when you return home. And crucially, if you have not yet been vaccinated against the conventional tick-borne encephalitis virus, make sure you get the jab from your GP as soon as possible. The encephalitis vaccine is available in Austria and works very well, but protecting yourself from the new Alangshan virus will require your own vigilance. And to close, a brief but instructive tale. One Vienna resident decided to deal with the problem of persistent pigeons beneath his window in rather too drastic a fashion, and simply shot at a bird from his balcony. The outcome proved unpleasant not only for the unfortunate bird. The court handed down a sentence of 8 months suspended imprisonment and a financial penalty. Austria's strict animal protection law, the Tierschutzgesetz, expressly prohibits causing pain or death to vertebrates without a legitimate reason. A pigeon that is simply cooing loudly does not qualify as one. So if you have a pest problem in your home, deal with it strictly through legal means. Contact the professional services available through the Magistrat. And on that note, that's all from Vienna, and we move on to news from the other federal states.
In Korneuburg, 20 kilometers from Vienna, this week's conversation was not about the budget or the heat wave. It was about a cat. A domestic cat declared itself the undisputed master of an entire neighborhood and set about proving it by force. According to local police, the cat bit and scratched several neighbors, a postal worker, 2 children, and, according to unofficial reports, 1 dog. Anyone who approached its entrance risked getting claws in the calves. The owners initially refused to believe their pet was capable of such aggression, but the number of victims reached a critical mass. Local police opened administrative proceedings. The most likely outcome? The owners will be required to keep the cat indoors or on a lead outside, which will probably make the cat even angrier. And there is not much that is actually amusing here, because in Austria, the owner is fully liable for the actions of their pet. If your cat or dog bites someone, be prepared to cover the medical bills. In cases of serious injury, a criminal case may also follow. Meanwhile, other news from Lower Austria is far less lighthearted. Last week, several serious incidents involving attacks on passengers and ÖBB railway staff occurred on trains running between St. Pölten and Vienna. As a result, the Transport Workers Union is once again demanding that body cameras be fitted to all conductors without exception, on the grounds that a visible, active camera tends to deter aggression quickly. The ÖBB management has not yet issued an official response to the request. But the question of safety on public transport, whether suburban trains, the metro, or trams, is becoming an increasingly pressing concern for passengers. If you personally have been the victim of or a witness to an attack, you must act quickly. Press the emergency call button for staff, which is present in every carriage. Call 133 directly for the police, and, if at all possible, stay in a safe location until the officers arrive. From Burgenland this week comes useful news for all owners of domestic or farm animals. On the 15th of June, a new veterinary emergency service, Tierarzt-Notdienst, went live in the state. Previously, in emergency situations, people had to call the General Medical Emergency number, 141, which frequently caused delays because regular operators did not know which vet was currently on duty. The system has now been completely split into 2 separate services, each with its own phone number. One dealing exclusively with pets under the name Heimtiernotdienst, and the other covering farm animals under the name Nutztiernotdienst. The farm animal service already has a direct number, 0576 0011 080, while the contact details for the domestic pet service can be found on the official Burgenland state website. Both services operate on a clear schedule, on weekdays from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., on Saturdays from noon to 11 p.m., and on Sundays and public holidays from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. If you live in Burgenland and have animals, save these numbers in your phone now, because in a crisis, you simply will not have time to search the internet.
In Graz, a new Rotes-Kreuz Steiermark building was opened and the organization's annual report was published, and the figures make for sobering reading. On one hand, volunteers distributed over 1 million kilograms of food to those in need, free of charge, a third more than the previous year, indicating that the number of people in hardship is growing. On the other hand, the Red Cross itself is in financial difficulty due to a dispute with the public health insurer, ÖGK. The insurer has for years refused to raise the rates it pays for medical services, even as the organization's costs for fuel and staff salaries have risen sharply. The branch director, Siegfried Schrittwieser, stated bluntly that the organization's books no longer balance, and that without additional state funding, it will be difficult to keep operating. For now, all services continue as normal, and those who wish to support the organization can do so by volunteering or donating via the official website. From Salzburg, a party political story with a practical dimension. The SPÖ, the Sozialdemokratische Partei Österreichs, has elected a new regional chair, Peter Eder, the head of the Salzburg Arbeiterkammer. Why does this matter? The SPÖ is one of the two main parties in the Austrian coalition government. Every regional chair is a potential candidate for a broader federal role, and the appointment of a figure from the Arbeiterkammer to lead a regional party organization sends a clear message. The party intends to focus on defending the interests of employees and the middle class. And finally, an irresistibly endearing story from Carinthia about a 3-year-old beagle named Daisy. Her owners welcomed her into their home at the start of April, but within just 3 days, the restless wanderer had escaped the garden and vanished. At first, the owners and local volunteers searched the surrounding area, but within a week, the dog unexpectedly turned up in the Italian town of Tarvisio. It emerged that in the space of a single day, she had crossed an international border entirely on her own and covered more than 40 kilometers along mountain trails. What followed was a genuine international rescue operation. Austrian and Italian volunteers joined forces, setting up camera traps along the route and placing food stations at strategic points. But the wily Daisy evaded every trap for nearly 2 months, covering 30 to 40 kilometers a day and regularly running back and forth across the border. She was only caught when Italian animal welfare volunteers transformed an entire private garden into an enormous trap with remotely controlled gates. Daisy returned home safe and unharmed, exactly 50 days after setting off on her wild European tour. On that uplifting note, we bring this episode to a close and move on to our important reminders.
First, if you're heading out into nature, make sure you protect yourself from ticks and check your body after walks. A new virus has been detected in the country. Second, don't wait until you're ill. Find a GP within the public insurance system in advance through the ÖGK website, as a third of practices have already closed their books to new patients. Third, if the cancellation of child benefit for unemployed individuals on subsidiary protection affects you personally, seek advice urgently from Caritas or Diakonie. And above all, this week brings an extreme heat wave of up to 40 degrees, so drink plenty of water, stay out of the midday sun, and never leave children or animals in a locked car. Thank you for being with us this week. We'll keep you informed of the most important developments. Subscribe to the weekly podcast Rot-Weiss-Rot REPORT, the podcast for those living and working in Austria. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. That's all for now. Speak to you next week.